Revolutions can lead to massive change, as the old is overthrown and replaced with something new, and the future itself is permanently changed. The past is littered with successful revolutions that have shaped the modern world. However, there are also countless examples of uprisings that, for whatever reason, failed to achieve their goals. But what if they had succeeded? If small changes to the past could have large effects on the future, such a massive and fundamental change would likely alter the modern world beyond recognition. Would the world we are living in today have been a brighter one, or might history have taken an even darker course, dooming us to an unthinkable present? Here are my choices for 5 failed rebellions that could have created an alternate history. Number 5. The Boxer Rebellion. In 1899, a violent uprising spread through China as members of a secret society known as the Righteous and Harmonious Fists launched indiscriminate attacks on Christians and foreigners across the country, culminating in a siege of the foreign quarter of Beijing, which was eventually broken by an unusual multi-nation alliance of countries who were otherwise divided and who just 15 years later would be fighting each other in the First World War. By the time the uprising was crushed, over 100,000 would be dead, with the ruling Chinese dynasty left weakened and close to collapse. The 19th century had been a traumatic time for Chinese national pride, as Japan and the Western powers had inflicted a series of humiliating defeats on the ancient and proud civilization, forcing the Qing government to accept unequal treaties and the presence of Christian missionaries, as well as giving Western nations and companies special privileges and control over Chinese economic affairs. China had fought against this interference, but lacking a modernized military, it stood little chance at resisting foreign aggression, and there were genuine fears that the country was slowly being colonized, piece by piece. These defeats and the unequal treaties which followed them caused immense resentment among the Chinese, and the poor living conditions experienced by many was blamed on foreign interference, with particular blame being placed upon Christian missionaries, whose activities were seen as part of Western imperialists' attempts to carve up their homeland. It was in this environment that the Righteous and Harmonious Fists flourished, a group who would later become known as the Boxers due to their practice of boxing rituals, which they believed gave them special powers, which made them impervious to bullets and other attacks. The Boxers were strongly anti-Christian and anti-foreigner, and their promises to drive out the foreign devils received widespread support, even receiving support from the Empress, who funneled money to the group and legalized the formation of civilian militias, helping the Boxers' recruiting activities. By 1900, Boxer militias were rampaging through the Chinese countryside, burning churches and foreign homes, and attacking Chinese Christians, missionaries, and foreigners on sight. They eventually moved into Beijing and laid siege to the foreign quarter of the city, trapping hundreds of foreign nationals in their quarters and in the Roman Catholic cathedral. This turn of events was deemed an unacceptable threat, and so a grand alliance of 8 of the world's major powers was formed, with the goal of suppressing the Boxer Revolution before things got out of hand. After a 55-day siege, the foreign embassies in Beijing were eventually relieved by a multinational force some 20,000 strong, which drove the Boxer forces from the city and defeated the imperial army. The international force then went on a rampage of plunder and revenge killings inside the city, and anyone suspected of being a Boxer was summarily executed. The hostilities finally came to an end after the signing of an agreement which provided reparations to the foreign powers. However, the Qing dynasty had been left weakened to such an extent that it would be overthrown just 11 years later, making it China's last imperial dynasty. Had the Boxers been successful, it's likely that China and the world would be a very different place today. The imperial dynasty might have avoided its fate and maintained power, which could have prevented the rise of the Chinese Communist Party, and perhaps today China would not be the economic power that it is, or perhaps it would have risen to power far earlier and even tipped the scales in one of the world wars. Whether China would have ended up weaker or stronger than it is today, the rebellion's success would have certainly had wide-ranging effects on the world. Number 4. The English Peasants Revolt. In 1381, the first widespread popular rebellion in English history would take place as years of frustration and anger at the ruling establishment and feudal system that had kept most of the population in serfdom bubble to the surface in a violent and seemingly unstoppable wave of revolts that spread across the country and culminated in London being captured and the king fleeing for his life. Prior to the revolt, England had been completely under the control of a ruthless class of aristocrats and elites who were more concerned with their own wealth and power than the well-being of the people, yet unhappiness with the status quo had been building for some time. The Black Death had caused a dramatic shift in the balance of power, as up to 1/3 of the population had perished, leading to a massive shortage in manpower, coupled with a plentiful supply of land. Those peasants who had been lucky enough to survive the dreaded plague now found that they were in a position to demand much higher payments in return for their labour, yet the landowners and nobility would not sit back and see their privilege eroded. Legislation was introduced which forced peasants to work for the same wages as before, restricted their ability to move freely from farm to farm, and removed their right to refuse their services to landowners. This attempt at limiting their wages understandably caused massive resentment, and coupled with the increased taxes to pay for the 100 Years' War in France, and the obligation to work for free for up to 2 days per week on church land, became almost unbearable. The stage for revolt was set, all that was needed was a final spark. When the poll tax was increased in 1381 to a rate 3 times higher than the previous year, many were simply unable to pay. A local tax collector in Essex would provide the spark needed to set the country alight when he became overly zealous in his work, causing entire villages to resist, while large bands of armed peasants sprung up all over the countryside. Stately manors were attacked and looted, while tax records and registers were burned. The rebellion quickly grew in popularity, and a man named Wat Tyler was chosen as its leader. The armed group was by now thousands strong, and headed straight for London, which they easily captured after local sympathisers opened the gates without resistance. King Richard II and his government were taken completely by surprise by the speed with which the rebellion spread, and he was forced to retreat into the relative safety of the Tower of London. With the city under rebel control, the mob's frustration and anger was taken out on political targets, with several government buildings destroyed and important officials executed on the street. With the majority of his forces either in France or the north of England, the young king had little option but to meet with the peasants and their leader. On the 14th of June, the two sides met just outside of London, where the rebels presented their list of demands, which included the abolition of serfdom and forced labour. Surprisingly, the king agreed, perhaps in a bid to buy time to gather his army, and the group dispersed. However, large numbers of rebels still remained in the city. A second meeting was arranged for the next day, however this time the peasant leader was cut down by the enraged Mayor of London after supposedly addressing the king with disrespect. As the furious crowd prepared to charge forward, the king rode out to them in an attempt to defuse the situation, convincing them to follow him away from the city, and in doing so bought time for the mayor to gather reinforcements which could be used to restore order. The crowd had dispersed believing the king's assurances, yet treachery was afoot. Wat Tyler's head was cut off and placed on a pole in the city of London, and with the militia now organised, the rebellion began to collapse. The king issued a proclamation which denied that he had ever agreed to any of the rebels' demands, and he set about crushing any remaining dissent. Most of the rebel leaders were killed in battles fought across the country, or were captured and executed, while the government reasserted control and carried on with business as usual. The month-long revolution had failed, yet what would England and the wider world have looked like today had the rebels succeeded? England would go on to have a huge impact on world history as the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution, forging a massive world empire and playing a major role in establishing the USA, which today is the main superpower on the world stage. Yet if the rebels had won, perhaps none of this would have happened. Would the USA still exist in its current form? What other rebellions might have spread across Europe, inspired by the success of the English Revolt? The wide-ranging effects of this change in history would have likely transformed the world today, perhaps rendering it almost unrecognisable. Number 3. The Satsuma Rebellion. In September 1877, the era of the legendary Japanese samurai would finally come to a bloody end on the slopes of an unremarkable hill. The last 40 men of a 20,000-strong rebel army charging to certain death against an enemy they considered to be inferior, their leader dead, and everything they had fought to preserve now rendered obsolete. So how did it come to this? The 19th century had been a period of great turmoil for Japan, as the previous centuries-old policy of isolationism could no longer stand up to the modern world the country found itself in. With predatory Western powers seeking to expand their influence all over the globe, Japan would need to quickly transform from a feudal country to an industrialized one if they were to avoid being colonized. Yet such rapid transformation was not welcomed by all. Modernization of Japan meant doing away with the privileged social status of the samurai and replacing them with a westernized army. This posed a threat not only to the social standing of the samurai, but also their financial interests, as the payments of rice, which had been their main source of income, were now abolished. Huge numbers of proud samurai were now left unemployed, with no purpose in life, and outraged by the massive changes to Japanese culture and society, which was widely seen as a betrayal of everything they had previously fought for. Japan had become a ticking time bomb. It was against this backdrop that the Satsuma Rebellion would break out in 1877 as a samurai army representing the traditional Japanese warrior class clashed with a westernized conscript army, both sides fighting to determine Japan's future course. The rebellion was led by Saigo Takamori, who was a samurai who had initially supported the government's reforms and even fought in earlier civil wars on the side of the emperor, yet had now grown concerned about the direction Japan was taking. He had been a strong advocate of war with Korea as a way in which out-of-work samurai could find a meaningful death, even going as far as to volunteer to embark upon a diplomatic mission during which he would insult the Koreans so badly that they would be forced to kill him, thus giving a cause for war. He went on to establish a private academy for unemployed samurai, which to the government seemed to be little more than a center for recruiting and training potential rebels. In 1876, the government sent a group of men to investigate the academy. However, they were captured and confessed under torture to having been sent to assassinate Saigo Takamori. With tensions already high, disaffected samurai and students at the academy now pushed for open rebellion, raiding weapons arsenals and forcing Saigo to come out of retirement and lead them against the government. The rebel samurai had initially viewed the government army of conscripts with disdain. However, they soon witnessed the effectiveness of modern weaponry and tactics and suffered a string of defeats at the hands of men they had considered to be inferior. Outnumbered and outgunned, the rebel forces were whittled down until they were eventually surrounded and destroyed. The majority of the samurai either surrendered or committed ritual suicide. However, Saigo and a small group of men managed to escape, only to be cornered once again where they made their famous last stand. Saigo was badly wounded and ended his own life, while his few remaining men charged down the hill to their deaths, marking the end of the rebellion and representing the last of the uprisings against Japan's westernization. In fighting to preserve the old ways, the samurai rebels had served as a bloody demonstration of how lower-class soldiers armed with modern weapons and trained with modern tactics could easily defeat the military nobility of old, paving the way for continued reforms and the establishment of a national Japanese army that would go on to dominate East Asia, humble the Western powers, and play a crucial role in the course of the 20th century. Had the rebellion succeeded, it's likely that history would have been radically different. The emperor might have been unable to continue with his reforms, perhaps even forcing Japan to abandon modernization and return to feudalism, leaving them open to being conquered by outside powers. It's also unlikely that Japan would have tried to build an empire in Asia, and would therefore have probably not been involved in both world wars, meaning that atomic bombs would not have been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Number 2. The Third Servile War. In 73 BC, a massive slave revolt set the heartlands of the Roman Republic aflame, as 120,000 vengeful slave rebels pillaged and slaughtered their way through the Italian countryside, defeating legion after legion sent to destroy them, and even threatening the great city of Rome itself. Although it's unknown exactly what the rebels' end goal was, their actions nearly destroyed one of the most powerful and influential empires the world has ever seen. Yet all their efforts would be for nothing, and within just 2 years, the majority of these ancient freedom fighters would have been sent to violent and gruesome deaths. Rome was no stranger to slave rebellions, and 2 had already been ruthlessly put down. The numerous wars of conquest that the Romans had been engaged in had perhaps yielded hundreds of thousands of slave captives, many of whom were imported into Italy to work as servants, miners, and farmers, where they would experience harsh treatment by their owners, treated as little more than private property that could be abused or even killed without legal consequences. Yet for others, a short and brutal life in a gladiatorial school, followed by a public death in the arena, was the fate that awaited them. This oppressive treatment, coupled with the high concentration of slaves within the Republic, provided a fertile ground for rebellion and would enable them to quickly grow in size as large numbers of new recruits were easy to come by. It was against this grim backdrop that 70 slave gladiators, led by a man named Spartacus, escaped from their school in Capua in 73 BC, annihilating the small force sent to apprehend them. They began terrorizing and plundering the area around Capua, their numbers growing as more freed slaves joined their ranks, and within 2 years they were perhaps over 100,000 strong. Time and time again, the rebel army of Spartacus proved itself an effective fighting force, defeating everything that the Romans sent against them, from local militias to fully fledged legions led by renowned consuls. To many Romans, this rebel army seemed almost invincible, and the slaves wandered around Italy with impunity, raiding towns and wealthy estates, and destroying any and all Roman forces they encountered. Whether they intended to simply flee north through the Alps and escape the clutches of Rome, or wished to destroy the Republic itself, is still debated, as no first-hand account of their motives exists, yet what is known is their luck quickly ran out. A massive force of 8 legions led by Crassus was sent to destroy them, with more reinforcements on the way under Pompey, as Rome mustered all their might to end the rebellion once and for all. Trapped in the south of Italy, perhaps after being betrayed by Cilician pirates who had promised to transport him to Sicily, the army of Spartacus made their last stand and attacked the 48,000 Romans under Crassus. The result was a disaster, and the slave army was utterly defeated, with Spartacus himself falling in battle, although his body was never found. 6,000 survivors of the battle were crucified along the Appian Way from Rome to Capua as a reminder of the fate that awaited any slave who dared rebel against their Roman masters. It's difficult to imagine just how different the world today might have been had Spartacus succeeded. Depending on the slave army's intentions, their victory could have led to the complete collapse of the Roman Republic, or at least left her weakened and humiliated, vulnerable to being picked apart by external enemies in the future. Even the spread of Christianity might have never happened, and Europe today may have remained a pagan society. With Rome playing such a pivotal role in the course of European history, whatever happened after a slave victory would have undoubtedly transformed the world as we know it today. Number 1. The Revolutions of 1848. In 1848, a series of dramatic revolutions swept across Europe, fueled by widespread discontent and new technologies, as people from Paris to Budapest rose up against what they saw as oppressive establishments in the hope of destroying the status quo and ridding themselves of monarchies and reactionary governments. Liberals wanted universal suffrage, nationalists saw a chance to finally redraw the map, throwing off the yoke of foreign rule, demanding independence or even the formation of entirely new countries, and socialists saw an opportunity to implement their idea of a workers' utopia. Such radical change in over 50 of the most powerful nations on Earth would have completely changed the course of history, but just a year later they had all completely failed. While it might seem unusual for so many revolts to break out at the same time, Europe had experienced something of a perfect storm of events that made such incredible levels of unrest a near certainty. Poor harvests had led to famines all over the continent, causing food prices to shoot up while wages remained low. As a result, consumer spending plummeted and unemployment rose, making the already hard life of the lower classes even more unbearable. Many toiled for up to 15 hours a day, working in dangerous factories and living in squalid slums, so it's no surprise that under such conditions, revolutionaries such as Karl Marx gained huge followings, and liberal anti-establishment ideas spread like wildfire, all aided by the recent developments in print technology, which made the distribution of ideas easier than ever. The wave of revolts began in Sicily in January 1848 and soon spread to over 50 countries as a coalition of various groups each pushed their own agendas, ranging from demands for all men to be given the vote to independence for different ethnic groups, and in the case of German and Italian states, even unification into an entirely new country. Yet this shaky coalition of different groups would ultimately fail due to a lack of organisation. The different groups didn't work together to coordinate their attacks, while the European monarchs did. Liberals and the middle classes feared the socialist workers, and when it came to the crunch, chose maintaining the rule of law and order over the uncertainty of revolution. The various European armies stayed loyal to their governments, and the uprisings were quickly and ruthlessly squashed, with tens of thousands killed, as each local uprising was crushed one by the full force of the state. Monarchy was re-established, and police persecution of the press and groups that had caused the unrest reached even greater extremes. The uprisings had been a complete failure, yet had the revolutionaries worked together, things could have been very different. Monarchies would have fallen, new nations would have been born, and new types of government would have been in power across the continent. During this period, European nations were arguably at the height of their power. Therefore, so many successful revolutions occurring at the same time would have had global effects, especially when you consider the size of the empires controlled by the European powers. The entire history of the world post-1848 would have been completely different, and for better or worse, today we would likely be living in a very different society. So those are my choices for 5 failed rebellions that could have created an alternate history. Let me know in the comments which rebellion you think would have had the biggest impact on history, and what you think the world might look like today had it succeeded, and I'll see you again next time.